All right. Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to our second afternoon session on metaphysical and linguistic problems. My name is Father Matt Gummess. I'm a Carmelite friar and visiting faculty here in Notre Dame's Great Books program, the program of liberal studies. I'll introduce each of the speakers individually before their papers. So first, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Lorraine Juliano Keller, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. She got her PhD at the University of Notre Dame in 2012. Her research is mainly on the nature of propositions, but she has also published papers on the theistic argument from intentionality, divine ineffability, Franciscan knowledge, and the distinction between real and notional assent. In addition, she has co-authored papers on nonsense and linguistic anti-realism. Her paper is entitled Polysemy and Analogy.
Thanks. Just like, how does this,
I think
down and up, or?
this should work to
the
advance
clicker?
the slides. Actually, maybe we're not on the right thing here. Let's just see. Zoom slideshow. Yeah. Or you can use the arrows, I think, as well.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. So first, I just have a confession to make. I'm a little bit of a, I feel like a poser or imposter here because I'm not really an Aquinas scholar. As my introduction, I guess, indicated, I mainly work in contemporary philosophy of language, metaphysics, sort of the intersection, and I just have a lot of interest in Aquinas, and I've been reading him over the years, but I'll probably butcher the Latin pronunciation and things like that. So please be patient with me here. This is something I got interested in. So I have a paper on divine ineffability, trying to kind of make sense of the semantics of our the way we, the assertions we make of God that are true or apt. Maybe they're not quite true. That's another question. But the apt predications we make with God that are what I would call positive intrinsic predications, so not the extrinsic sort of predications, not the negative predications, but we're trying to talk about God in God's own self. So I've been kind of working on the semantics of that, and this is just one piece of that. So just a quick qualification. So I'm going to be talking about Aquinas' doctrine of analogy, and as I'm going to mispronounce his name, Joshua Hochschild has pointed out, it's really important to note these different senses of analogy that you can find in Aquinas. So there's more of a metaphysical or ontological sense, and then there's more of a linguistic sense. And my focus is going to be on linguistic analogy as applied to divine names. He calls them divine names. It's really predicates. Just some quick background. This is probably just very remedial for everyone here, but just to have everything in place, there are three types of predication: univocal, equivocal, and analogical. There's just three different examples there. And an intuitive way of characterizing them is as follows. So you might say a term F is predicated univocally in sentences S1 and S2 if and only if S has exactly the same meaning in S1 and S2. It makes the same contribution to the meanings of those sentences. That's meaning is sort of a weasel word, I know, but I'm just going to kind of keep it vague for now. Instances of F1 and F2 of an orthographic form F are predicated equivocally in S1 and S2 if and only if F1 and F2 have different unrelated meanings in those sentences. So they're making completely different contributions to the meanings of S1 and S2. And then instances F1 and F2 of an orthographic form F are predicated analogically in two different sentences, if and only if they have different but related meanings in S1 and S2. So they're making different but related contributions to the meanings of S1 and S2. I think that's a really intuitive way of understanding what's going on with analogy. With linguistic analogy. I'm going to talk about an argument against that later, and I'm going to try to respond to that argument, because I realize that this way of putting things kind of is stacking the deck in a certain way. So I'll come back to that later. So just some key points from Aquinas. So Aquinas, I've got a long quote here from the Summa, where all of these different parts of these quotes are incorporated. So one big takeaway is that he says very clearly that univocal predication of creatures and God is impossible, that analogical predication is apt, and that our analogical language should reflect the fact that God is the exemplar cause of perfections in creatures. The relevant names refer to God in a primary sense. I'll talk about this more later. And not merely the cause, but also that the creatures participate in and have a certain likeness to or similarity of God with respect to those predications. Okay, so the quote here, whatever is said of God and creatures is said insofar as the creature is ordered toward God as toward a principle and cause in which the perfections of all things preexist in a most excellent way, and that this mode of commonality falls between pure equivocation and simple univocity. So an important point is that this doctrine is applying to literal speech. Obviously, there's a lot of metaphorical speech of God, right? So some examples that Aquinas likes to use: God is a lion, God is my rock. Because the terms lion and rock presuppose imperfection, they must be understood to be predicated metaphorically of God. But terms like good, wise, living, and being do not presuppose any sort of imperfection. They're what is commonly called pure perfection terms. And thus, Aquinas thinks that predications like God is good are literally true. However, God is good, and for example, Socrates is good, are not on a par either with respect to their semantics, that is what they mean, or their epistemology, how we understand them. So then, just a quick note about the motivation. Again, this is probably just something that's just review for everyone here. Why does Aquinas think univocity is impossible? So there's just a quote about that, and then why he thinks equivocity is also not the way to go, because nothing could be known or demonstrated about God at all. Therefore, it must be said that these names are said of God and creatures in an analogous sense so that we can actually know something or demonstrate things about God. And it's a vexed question if analogy actually allows him to preserve that. There's a lot of people that argue about that. I'm not going to get into that here. As I see it, the real reason that Aquinas is anti-univocity is his commitment to the doctrine of divine simplicity, right? That in God there's no distinction between matter and form, substance and accident, essence and existence. So God is not distinct from God's attributes, and that's going to be kind of a big part of the motivation for saying there's something weird going on with these predications, and you can't treat them as exactly the same as the sort of predications we would make of creatures. So there's three sort of important terms. I'm realizing, sorry, I'm pausing a little bit here because I'm realizing I updated my slides and somehow I guess I forgot to save them. So now I'm noticing things in here that I'm like, hey, wait a minute, I changed that. It's not changed. So I'm a little bit dismayed by that. I don't know what happened. So there's again, I'm going to butcher the Latin, the res significata, the ratio nominis, and the modus significandi. So it's not possible to really translate these terms into contemporary semantic categories. I'm still in the process of learning medieval semantics myself, but as I've come to understand it, it's not like you can get a dictionary and translate between the two frameworks. It's like learn a different language. So I'm still learning the language, so forgive me if I mess anything up. So res significata is something like the referential content or the bit of reality that the term signifies. The ratio nominis is something like the concept associated with the word that captures its definition, maybe similar to what we would call sense, not in the Fregean sense because it's not an abstract object, but if senses are understood as mental things. And then there's the modus significandi, which is very, I think, complex and hard to explain. Something like the way a term signifies according to its syntax, which would include features such as the part of speech it is, whether it's a noun, verb, etc., tense, gender, and case, all those kinds of things that get encoded, whether it's abstract or concrete, and then what kind of predication is it, like quantification according to, you know, Aristotelian categories. So in predications of pure perfections to God, we can affirm their res significata, but we have to deny their modus significandi. So why can we affirm their res significata? Because wisdom applies to God more aptly than it applies to us. God is pure wisdom, whereas human beings are only imperfectly wise. However, since our intellects can understand by composing and dividing, we can only form these predications in a way that misleadingly suggests that God is the subject to which the accident signified by the predicate applies, thus denying God's simplicity. For this reason, we have to deny the modus significandi of the predicate. And I'm just following various commentators here. This is, you know, I don't pretend that I'm the expert about this. So what sort of analogy is at work in Aquinas? It's the analogy of proportion, which is based on Aristotle's equivocation pros hen, sometimes called focal meaning, where different senses are unified by relation to one primary sense. So he says, for an analogy, the idea is not as in univocals one and the same, yet it is not totally diverse as in equivocals. So you've got many things proportionate to one, right? You've got the healthy urine, which is a symptom, the healthy food, which is a cause of what's primary, which is the health of the animal. Happy songs, which are a cause, happy smile, which is a symptom in relation to the happiness of the student. Okay, and so that's the sort of analogy that's at work here. And it's important for Aquinas that the res significata of pure perfection terms is in God primarily. So when we use these terms, the reality we are pointing to is in God. However, we understand these terms by our interaction with finite creatures. Thus, the ratio nominis of pure perfection terms is not apt for comprehending the way they apply to God. And for Aquinas, all reference is conceptually mediated. There's no direct reference. So even the res significata is going to be sort of infected by the ratio nominis, if I could put it that way. Okay. So when we predicate pure perfection terms to God, our predications are correct because the reality that those predicates point to is in God. But our composite way of predicating and our limited creaturely conception of those terms makes our predications defective. So we don't understand the goodness that exists preeminently in God, nor do we understand God in God's simplicity, though we can correctly claim that God is simple. Okay, so the real point of my project is to kind of put Aquinas in dialogue with sort of contemporary work in philosophy of language and linguistics. And this is sort of just a creative engagement, and I don't claim that everything I'm going to say is ends up being completely faithful to Aquinas' view. I'm trying as hard as I can to kind of make it comprehensible to somebody who works. So for me, I'm trying to make Aquinas comprehensible to myself. So I really think he has a lot of great ideas, and I want to understand what he's saying and what he's up to. So I'm trying to kind of put it in a contemporary framework that I can understand, and hopefully bring some other analytic philosophers on board. So when I had read about this, I thought, well, it seems like analogy is a type of polysemy, which is something that's talked about a lot in linguistics, and that actually, like, there's been an explosion of work on polysemy recently. Some background. So linguists will talk about what's called the mental lexicon, which is just kind of like what you might think it is, right? It's kind of like your inner dictionary. So it's the particular language user's knowledge of her own vocabulary, the place where the representations of word meanings are stored. Lots of linguists, unlike philosophers who work on semantics, are internalists about lexical semantics and think that word meanings are structured representations in the head of speakers. Though there are some, like Peter Ludlow, that think that you can, well, he's sort of a philosopher and a linguist, but he thinks that you can kind of have it both ways, and you have your externalism and have what the linguists want to do too. So I'm not going to get into that whole dispute here, but just to kind of acknowledge that there is this psychological piece that is going on, or this internal piece that is going on, whether or not we're going to say there's, how that relates to the other pieces. So two words are mere homonyms if they sound the same but have distinct unrelated meanings. This is just very familiar, right? So port, the dessert wine, versus the port where ships dock. drawing a picture versus drawing the curtains. If you've ever read the Amelia Bedelia books with your kids or on your own, lots of examples there. A dog's bark versus the tree's bark, right? They're just completely unrelated meanings. So polysemy occurs when one word has distinct but related meanings. So intuitively, in the cases of polysemy, there's just one entry in the mental lexicon with different subheadings. And when there are distinct entries, you have a case of homonymy. So this mirrors how things actually work in the dictionaries that are on our shelves, right? So there are separate entries for the port, the wine, and port where ship stock, but you wouldn't find separate entries for school as an institution and school as a building in the dictionary. Again, that's not like, not saying we should use the dictionary as any sort of evidence, but it reflects to a large extent what's going on in our heads. So it seems like there's a real parallel between analogy, linguistic analogy, and polysemy. So analogy is a mean between equivocity and univocity, and polysemy is kind of a mean between monosomy and mere homonymy, right? So in monosomy, there's just one word, just one form that has one meaning. In homonymy, there are different unrelated meanings associated with one form, something that's orthographically unique. And then with polysemy, you've got different different related senses. Again, just some more examples of homonymy and polysemy. Right, Gabriel drew a line, Vigo read a line. The university has many degree programs. The university straddles City Avenue. So the idea is like, there's not one thing that can be the source of degree programs and be, taking up space on and having a certain spatial location. So linguists also distinguish between regular and irregular polysemy, right? And regular polysemy is what happens when basically you've got lots of different, lots of other words that have the same sort of semantic distinctions as the original, right? So examples of regular polysemy would be just like sort of categories of words that are polysemes, like animal and food, like fried chicken, pet chicken, artwork and artist, type, token, container, contents, building, institution. So right, there's a pattern there. And then irregular polysemy is kind of like there's a one-off. And it's hard to find examples because you could always think, well, maybe if we keep looking at the language, we'll find another instance of something like this. So one example that I found was run a mile versus run a business, which is supposed to be unique in English in terms of the semantic relations. Okay, I see I'm running out of time. Oh, 5 minutes? Okay. So another distinction is in different hypotheses about how polysemes are mentally represented. So there's the sense enumeration hypothesis, which holds that each distinct meaning of a polysemous word has its own distinct representation in the mental lexicon. This would weaken the distinction between homonymy and polysemy. And then there's the one representation hypothesis, which holds that the different meanings either belong to or depend on a single representation that speakers use to access all the different meanings, right? So there's one sort of primary representation, and they access all of the meanings by reference to that, rather than having to go to kind of different like folders or something like that. So my thesis is that pure perfection terms exhibit a kind of polysemy. They're a type of polyseme. They have distinct but related meanings when applied to creatures and to God. And I think that analogy might be thought of as a type of regular polysemy. So it's not a one-off. There's a class of terms that exhibit this type of polysemy, the class of perfection terms, that we grasp by our experience with creatures, but nonetheless correctly apply to God. And I'm not so sure about this part of it, but I think the one representation hypothesis might be a good fit for Aquinas' view of linguistic analogy, since he seems to follow Aristotle in holding there's a primary or focal meaning to which all the different analogous senses are related. And this presumably would be the representation that's stored in the mental lexicon that gives the speaker access to the other senses under which it's stored. So there's an important question about how this mental representation would work with pure perfection terms. So with regular polysemes, we have access to the different representations that fall under the primary representation, right? So we have fairly complete grasp of like healthy as applied to an animal and healthy as applied to a symptom. But with pure perfection terms, we definitely have access to their creaturely meanings, but what about when we apply them to God? What is going on there exactly? We don't have a grasp of God's goodness, right? Since God's goodness isn't distinct from God's essence, and we don't grasp God's essence. So one idea is that we take our concept of creaturely goodness, negate the creaturely limitations contained in it, and then apply that related sense of the term to God. And also you might think it gets positive content from thinking about ways that God can be imitated by creatures, or ways that creatures are similar to God or reflect God's perfections. So an argument, so I haven't seen this argument in print, but somebody told me that Brian Leftow made this argument somewhere, and I've not been able to find it, and nobody can tell me where it is. If anybody knows where, I'd be happy to know. So an opposing view is that analogy is not a type of polysemy, because the pure perfection terms mean exactly the same thing when applied to God and to creatures. Right? Wise and God is wise and Socrates is wise are monosemous, and the analogical aspect of the predication involves only how the predicates apply to the subjects. Or speaking at the level of ontology, the analogy applies to the having of the relevant attributes. So Socrates is wise by participating in God's wisdom, and God is wise by being wisdom. So that's where the distinction is. It's not, there's no distinction in meaning between the two terms. And you don't need to say there's a distinction in meaning to explain what's going on in analogical predication. So that's the argument. Again, I've not seen it in print. I would love to find it, but I don't know where it is. So this would just make this whole thing like otios, right? You don't need to do anything at the level of meaning. So I think that this way of looking at things, this sort of objection, neglects an important distinction between what you might think of as like worldly truth makers versus semantics, right? So consider that when we talk about like, when we say God is wise or God is good, well, there'd be one truth maker for those two claims, right? They're both true in virtue of, it's God that makes them true, right? God's self, right? But they don't have the same meaning, and even Aquinas says that these terms are not synonymous, right? So it doesn't seem faithful to Aquinas either. So maybe a way to think about that is that the worldly truth makers are akin in some way, not perfectly, again, I know there's not an exact translation, to the res significata associated with the relevant predications, while their meanings are at the level of ratio nominis, or maybe some combination of ratio nominis and modus significandi, again, with the problem of not having an exact translation there. So on this view, healthy horse and healthy urine are polysemes with different but related senses belonging to one orthographic/phonetic form. They are associated with different sub-entries in the mental lexicon. At the level of ontology, though, there's just one property in virtue with both the horse and the urine are called healthy, the health of the horse. The urine doesn't have a distinct property in virtue of which healthy is applied to it. It's all referred to its being a symptom of the horse's health. Similarly, you might say good, as it appears in God is good and St. Francis is good, are polysemes at the level of semantics. They're associated with different but related representations in the mental lexicon. But this is not to deny that at the level of ontology, there's only one goodness, God's, by which we can truly say that God is good and St. Francis is good. So I think that's it. I think we're right at time. Thanks.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions. We are running 5 minutes behind schedule, but since we were interrupted by the Notre Dame emergency alert, I hope it's okay if we just stay 5 minutes extra at the end. So yes, questions from the floor.
I was wondering why polysemy is even motivated versus kind of semantic generalities. So sometimes one word with one meaning can apply to many different things that are very different between each other. Like jade, there are different kinds of jade, but that's okay. It's not because it's polysemous. Sibling isn't polysemous between brother and sister. They're just kinds of siblings. I guess people are thinking that there are tests for polysemy in the case of healthy horse and healthy urine, where it's hard to generalize through a group, but it seems okay to generalize through a group with the attributions of God, right? I'm thinking about a bunch of good people and Jesus and St. Francis and...
Good. I think think.
Can you say something about why even polysemy is motivated?
Yeah, so I think the test you're thinking about is called co-predication, right? So there's like a big literature on that too. Like, the book is heavy and interesting. And it's like, well, there's not one thing that can be like have weight and be interesting. It's like you're talking about a physical object that's like sitting, taking up room on your shelf versus it like an information content. Right? And there's huge debates about this. Like, and I think it's Magador tries to say, no, you can have these like weird objects. You can just have one kind of weird object that has all these different sort of properties that seem incompatible. Right, but that's one test. And I thought about that with this, and this is why I didn't bring it up, actually, because it is a hard one for this. So I did think about it. I don't think it's a huge problem, though, so I see what you're saying. Like, can't we just say, like, God is wise, and Socrates is wise, too, right? Like, God is wise, and so is Socrates, right? Where you have that sort of anaphora going on, right? Yeah, and I think it does seem like we can say that. And the reason why that's problematic is that, so I think that a lot of people don't understand divine simplicity or aren't committed to divine simplicity. So I think a lot of philosophers of religion, for example, who study this stuff would be totally happy to say that, because they'd say like, yeah, God has this property, right, of being wise. God's just related to this property, just like Socrates is. And so it has to do with a certain sort of theological commitment. And so I think when you're in that framework, you would realize that, oh, actually, that doesn't really make sense. And there's a whole like larger, so at the level of like, well, if we're just talking about the way speakers use words or how they understand them, well, if the speaker's understanding them, like, they're using them incorrectly, I guess I would say, right? If they're thinking that this means exactly the same thing, they're making a mistake in how they're thinking about God. Sorry, what was I going to say? Sorry, I lost my train of thought. But yeah, that strictly speaking, it would not be the same meaning once you have that divine simplicity in place, and Aquinas' other sort of commitments.
Right, and I was wondering why that affects the language rather than the metaphysics, right? So the two kinds of jadeite and nephrite are not very similar at all, but that doesn't put any pressure on thinking jade is polysemous. So likewise, the wisdom
Right.
of Socrates and the wisdom of God are not at all similar, they're not even the same kind of thing. But why would that make a linguistic difference as opposed to a metaphysical difference?
Wait, can you spell out the jade example a little bit more for me?
So the standard linguistics, so at least in English, different languages do it differently. There's two kinds of, well, we use jade for two kinds of mineral,
Jadeite and nephrite, yeah.
And they're chemically very different. They have different properties. They play a bit of a similar role in the jewelry market, but even that's kind of distinct. But the standard view is, look, English just uses this one word for these two kinds of things. And the two kinds are very different, but it's not polysemy or ambiguity or anything. It's just the extension of this word jade includes everything of type A and everything of type B.
Right.
So basically the distinctions the language draws and the distinction the worlds draw can come apart in these ways. And sometimes you can have a word that applies to lots of things. And one option for divine language is, okay, the way God's wise is utterly different from the way that Socrates is wise, right? God's identical to wisdom, that's not even the same kind of thing. But that doesn't yet mean the language has to, there could just be this
Right.
extension of the word wise and God's in there and Socrates.
Right, could have a disjunctive sort of
Yeah,
extension.
metaphysical analysis is going to be this messy thing, but
Yeah, so good. So, I mean, I think that's, whether you want to say something like that too is going to be like affected by how you think about the semantics too. And I think for Aquinas, he's going to say, oh, well, you learn this word, you learn these words by your experience with creatures, right? So that's where the meaning comes from, right? So the ratio nominis is going to come from your experience of creatures. And so it's going to sort of, that concept's going to contain all these like creaturely limitations and things like that aren't going to be aptly applied to God. And so that's going to be like the primary sense. And I don't know if that quite answers the question, but I think
yeah, it's a kind of philosophy of language motivation for thinking. It couldn't be one meaning
Yeah, it's a different framework for thinking about it. And it's not like the most popular one among contemporary philosophers of language, right? But yeah, but that would be his framework.
Thanks. So this was really cool. So one thing you might find interesting is that on basically all three of the positions that you laid out, so the non-polysemy, and then among the polysemy folks, the one versus multiple.
Yeah.
I forget how you characterize that.
Oh, I can.
All three of those positions are occupied by people in the Thomistic tradition from between like 1300 to today. So like the Leftow view, I don't know whether he's just straight up getting that from Ralph McInerney, who taught here, but that's definitely McInerney's.
Thank you.
Is the res significata does not change between God and creatures, and only the modus significandi is changing.
Okay.
So that's McInerney, and then Thomas DeVio Cardinal Pagadin is a good example of it's analogous, it's polysemous, but there are a multiplicity of, there's no one thing that you're kind of mentally focusing on that's then kind of like making an appearance in all of the cases.
Okay.
And then if you want names for the one ratio view, I can give you that as well.
No, that would be great,
yeah,
actually.
they're all populated. Yeah.
No, thank you so
And
much.
was like highly debated. Yeah.
That would make it so much better if I could put in some
Cool.
commentators that have these
Yeah.
views. Thank you.
Thanks for that talk. This is very cool. One of the main challenges coming to vendors of university, at least in the medieval period, was the challenge that analogical terms can't use them validly as a middle term in a syllogism.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there's been any work on that with polysemous terms and their sort of logical properties. They're truth preserving.
Yeah, good. I don't know of any, but that's been in the back of my mind as I need to, life is short and got a lot of research projects going on. But no, but that's been in the back of my mind as something that I need to really look into because it really bothers me too. And trying to understand, how Aquinas kind of deals with that, because that's one of his motives for invoking analogy as opposed to equivocity is, oh look, so you can do these demonstrations. It's like, how exactly does that work? Yeah, I do not have an answer, and I wish I did. But
We're at time, but thank you very much,
thank
Dr.
you.
Keller.
Thank you.
Next, it's my pleasure to welcome Pasquale Viola. He is an Italian graduate student at the University of Italian Switzerland, Lugano. He got his BA both at the University of Naples, Federico II, and at the second, and at the Pontifical University, Thomas Aquinas Angelicum. His research interests lie in applying contemporary analytic metaphysical questions to medieval philosophers, particularly in areas such as Mereology, theories of location, and truth makers. He is currently working on theories of truth and truth maker in late medieval philosophy for his master's thesis, supervised by Professor John Maranbol. His paper is entitled "The Metaphysics of Holes in Aquinas: A Mereological Perspective." Let's welcome our next speaker. Let me just pull up your. See if it works now. Yeah, there we go.
Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for, for the organization of this conference. I'm gonna talk about Aquinas on negative entities. Great part of my paper is indebted to a course I attended in Rome in the Angelicum, thanks to Father Bonino. Basically, my view, according to my interpretation, Aquinas held two kinds of negative entities. I want to encourage you to be aware of the fact that this is not a well-definite paper. I'm here. The aim of being here is just to gather as feedback as possible. So I'm gonna say that Aquinas see negative entities as non-existent at all, or that negative entities exist in the world by being ontologically dependent on other entities. Well, if privation stands for the first kind, then there is no truth maker that account for truth apt proposition they are involved in. And if privation stands for the second option, then there is a truth maker that accounts for them. The other kind of problem I will try to deal with is the problem of what is for a part of our properties or for our capabilities to ought to be there, and how we know metaphysically, not epistemically, that some parts or some property ought to be there or should be there. So the thesis of the So this presentation, in the first part of this presentation, I will give Aquinas' account of Mereological ilomorphism. I will define his Mereology in terms of ilomorphic slot Mereology. Basically, according to slot Mereology, to have a part for a substance is for that part to fill a slot provided by the substance, structure, or substantial form. For instance, the door is a proper part of the house if and only if the door fills one of the appropriate slot of the house. In the second part, I will describe and analyze Aquinas' metaphysics of privation concerning lux and malfunction. Sorry, this is a type, not privation, malfunction. So lux and malfunction are the two types or negative entities I'm going to argue for. So I will, as I said before, in the first part, I will make a bit of introduction to what is for Aquinas substantial form and accidental form, and what are the role they play in a Mereological wall. So accordingly, substantial form provide unity, definition, and metaphysical composition, while accidental form, provide a structure of artifacts and are predicated of feature of substances, accidental feature of substances. So according to the first text, I like to choose this text just to make a plausible idea of what is for Aquinas, what is the role the accidental form plays in the compound. The form of the house is accidental. Therefore, this form does not ground the existence or the species, neither of the whole nor of its part. Indeed, it's not even a unified whole simpliciter, but just a unified whole by aggregation. Namely, accidental form do not play any kind of metaphysical bearing, neither on the whole nor in its part. So, on the other hand, the soul is the substantial form of the body. It grounds the existent and the species of both the whole and the parts. So here we have a kind of metaphysical bearing. Substantial form plays in the whole and in the parts. So we have that X an accidental form of the composite Y, if and only if X does not determine the natural configuration and the kind of membership of the part of the composite Y, and X does not determine the existence of the composite Y, while X is a substantial form of the composite S if and only if X determines the natural configuration and the kind membership or species of the part of the composite S, and so X determines the existence of S. So substantial form plays this role of changing like the nature of part that are involved in the whole, such that the part come to have new qualitative properties and new physical configuration. So I will talk about Aquinas' Mereology. Mereology is try to capture the part-whole relation, and obviously Aquinas move in the Aristotelian notion of quantity. Accordingly, quantities are items that can be divided into parts. They can be discrete and continuous. Discrete quantities are number, utterances, and parts share no boundaries but are adjacent to each other, while continuous quantities are bodies, lines, times, and they have parts that share common boundaries, with their adjacent parts. So I'm gonna talk about which kind of wall, quantitative wall, Aquinas conceive. This text is taken by Summa Theologiae, question 11. So Aquinas says that the wall can be of two kinds, heterogeneous and homogeneous. According to the homogeneous, the wall is constituted by parts that are same, that have same form as the wall. Instead, heterogeneous wall have each of part different in form. So each of the part lacks the form of the wall. So X is an homogeneous wall if and only if X has a form F, and for all X quantitative part, the B's, each B has a form F, while the other way, on the other hand, heterogeneous wall, X is an heterogeneous wall if and only if X has a form, and for all X quantitative part, the B's, none of the B's has the form F. A very easy example, I am a human being, my hand is not a human being. Aquinas add that quantitative wall can be perfect, so I try to understand what is for a quantitative wall to be perfect. Accordingly, the perfection of the wall obtained due to its part, that is, that a wall is such if none of its parts miss, parts by which the nature of the wall is predicated. So the wall is constituted according to its nature. So we have not just quantitative part. Given its substantial form, the quantitative wall is perfect not only in case of proper part, but also also even if quantitative walls instantiate essential and necessary properties and theological disposition. So Aquinas gives three requirements for a quantitative wall to be perfect. X is a perfect wall if and only if X lacks none of its quantitative part determined by X substantial form. Then he says that X has power or disposition that neither exceed nor are inferior as to its nature. For instance, an eagle can fly quickly, but it does not fly at the speed of an airplane. And he says this in Lectura 21, book 5, in his commentary to Metaphysics. So, and the third point is that X achieves appropriate aims and goals given by its substantial form. So here we have our three requirements. Well, this account of perfection of quantitative wall is important to define what is for a wall to lack one or more of its part. That's why I sketched. Aquinas remarked that a privation is the absence of something that should be, and indeed we can refer to lacking part just because they should be there. Therefore, we need to understand what is for a part or a property that ought to be present. This can be highlighted by a resemblance of Aquinas' helomorphic Mereology and the helomorphic slot Mereology. So I define this kind of part to ought to be part, so part that should exist. And in order to better understand this problem, I used slot Mereology. As I said before, parts are defined in terms of their filling a slot. That is, X is part of Y, if and only if X fill a slot of Y, and the slot of Y are provided by the structure of Y, that is its substantial form. Also, here we have an house, and the house structure determines the kinds of slots to be filled in virtue of what an house is. For instance, to be a house is to be composed such that there is a door, a kitchen, and so on. And I use the term kind of slot to mean that substantial form determines slots that are apt to be filled only by certain proper parts. If the substantial form of a house determines that it has to be composed of three slots, apt to be filled by part of different kind, then the structure of accidental form of the house determines that there are at least 3 slots to be filled by appropriate proper part, the x's. So, for instance, consider again an organism like a human being. The human being substantial form determines the various type of slot to be filled, such as heart kind slot, lung kind slot, muscle kind slot, and so forth. But how do slot fillers compose the whole? Very basically, if a human being substantial form determines a slot up to be filled by a part, then the proper part that fill it must be of the arm kind, such that it is arm-shaped and it has all the qualitative and dispositional property an arm has when and only when it's part of the human body. For instance, a chair leg cannot fill the arm slot, as it's not the same as it's not of the same kind and lacks the property required to be to fill the slot designated by an arm. So this is the principle that it's usually used in slot Mereology. So X fill the slot A of the whole Y, of the whole Y, if and only if the slot A is apt to be filled by the kind of part X is. And so, can we talk, does it make sense about talking of Aquinas slot Mereology? So according to me, Aquinas sees substantial form playing a similar role in material object as the structure in slot Mereology. In the case of quantitative heterogeneous substances, the substantial form determines which slot a whole must have and determines the kind of its proper part or slot filler, their qualitative properties and their functional role, as we saw in text 2 and 4. So in the case of quantitative heterogeneous artifact, the artificial form determines which slot an artifact must have and does not determine the kind of its member, but just functional role of the proper part that fill the slot. Indeed, I think that by T2 and T4, this text you see in the slides, Aquinas would accept slot part identity principle, according to which if a proper part fill a slot, that part is of a kind required by the slot. So we can have a further principle on by uniting Aquinas ilomorphic Mereology and slot Mereology, and so we have that X is a part of Y if and only if X fill an appropriate slot of Y determined by the substantial form of Y. The slot filled by X is apt to be filled just by the kind of quantitative part X is, and the slot filler X has a new qualitative properties and functional role within the whole. So again, sorry if the definition are many. So we can now abstract a new further principle that's Aquinas heterogeneous perfect whole according to slot Mereology, which is a mix of Aquinas perfection of quantitative whole and Aquinas ilomorphic slot Mereology, which is this. So every slot determined by X substantial form is filled by a quantitative part of the appropriate kind. Every quantitative part which fills the slot has new qualitative properties and functional role within the whole. The power or disposition of every quantitative part that fill the slot are neither excessive nor inferior to their nature. And every quantitative part which fill the slot achieve appropriate aims and goals determined by the slot they fill and by X substantial form. So let's move on to metaphysics of privation. As I said before, I try to interpret Aquinas on negative entities as sustaining two kinds of privation, which I call lacking and malfunction. So the first is supported in lots of texts, but mainly in Question 48 of Summa Theologiae. Aquinas, with a very brief but elegant argument, argue that everything that exists is good. Evil is the opposite of goodness, therefore evil does not exist. And Aquinas justifies this argument by saying that evil does not exist as a substance or an object, but as a privation. The kind of privation stands for an absence of a good. He said, significatur absentia boni. What is good stands for either a satisfaction or fulfillment or of a natural tendency of any entity whatsoever, or for the existence of something, because to exist fulfill the tendency of a form. By transitivity, if what is good is what exists and the object of natural tendencies, then privation of good either stands for the absence of what should exist but is not, or the absence of the object of natural tendency, that is, a frustration. I think that Aquinas' lot Mereology can make things far easier to understand. Yes, this is like another text from De Malo, the first article of De Malo, the first question of De Malo, in which he says, what lack some individual good, that evil is what lack some individual good, that is required for its perfection. So, if to be perfect, a perfect whole is to lack none of its part and none of its power and abilities given by its nature, and none of the functional goal, therefore the privation in a whole is the absence of either a number n of part, or the absence of n power and abilities, or the absence of n functional role. In terms of slot Mereology, privation are unfilled slot. So slots determined by substantial form up to be filled by proper part that do not fill them. So we have the slot encoded by substantial form, but we have nothing which fill it. That's why we can talk about proper part that should be there, but they are not. So, and in Lectura 21 of Book 5, commentary to Metaphysics, Aquinas even describe which kind of part in quantitative whole can lack. So, according to Aquinas, a part X lacks in the heterogeneous quantitative whole if and only if X is a sine qua non part, so a part pivotal for the persistence of the quantitative continuous part. If X is placed at the extremity of the compound, so the hands or feet of human beings, or like in case of mutilation, X can be either regenerated by the whole, like hairs, once cut off, can be regenerated, or cannot be regenerated by the whole, like mutilated part. Then we move on to malfunction. I took this text by Summa Theologia, question 49. Aquinas says evil is a defect of what is good, that is natural and should be possessed. Now, I do not take a defect as a synonymous with absentia, just because my defect exists in the word while absence do not, while privation as absences have no reference in the word, that is, there is nothing in the word such that it is absent, it seems that defects can have references in the word. So here there is another text. Aquinas says in question 49, in the action, the evil is caused by a defect of some principle of action or principle of the agent, or of some instrument, such as the defects in the movement of an animal occurs either because of a deficiency of the capability of moving, or due to the deficiency of a part, as in the lame. So, but one can say that a defect seems to be a cause of a privation and not a privation itself. Therefore, defects are not privation at all, but the efficiency by nature is neither something established by substantial form nor something good. Therefore, it's a privation. Like the cause of a defect in a movement of an animal is either a deficiency of an organism or a deficiency of a part of the organism. The deficiency of the organism or of a part of the organism does not stand for the lack or the absence of a part of the organism, but for a malfunction of it. That is, a failure in performing functional role or capabilities set by substantial form, and thus a breakdown in the web of functional relation among part of the organism. That is, proper part fail in their functional role or disposition within the whole. According to my interpretation, then, the case of malfunction would imply that nothing supposed to exist lacks, but what exists is not performing as determined by its proper substantial form. And in terms of slot Mereology, every slot is filled by proper parts, but proper parts or slot filler do not completely satisfy the requirement the slot attributes to them once they are part of the compound. Thanks.
We have time for a few questions.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting. So a blind eye is a malfunction?
Yes, that's a good point. That's why it's ancora it's still a sketchy paper. So blind eye can be seen in two ways. Like either you have no eyes and I can still say that you are blind, but in that case it's a lack, like you have no proper part. But if you have eyes, but you just don't see, you do not possess this capability, then there is a proper part, but there is a malfunction in your proper part, which feel a slot encoded by substantial form, but there is no capabilities just because the
I still don't understand exactly. Maybe I'm missing something. How can you skip the language of absence? Because it seems that there is a positive malfunction, but the cause of the positive malfunction is the absence. So the evil is the lack of sight, which is an absence, right? It's not a malfunction.
So can you repeat?
So there is a malfunction in the eye I don't see, right? That thing causally relates to the lack of sight, which is the evil, though, right? The evil is.
Right. No. Yes, it's a privation, but it's not a lack of something. I can see that you are blind, but what you miss is just the capabilities, but not the quantitative part, like the proper part.
Well, there is a lack of a power that is activated.
Yeah, I understand your point. You say there is still a lack of capabilities. Therefore, we can say that is a lack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sam might have been the next question.
I mean, maybe the thought is that the lack of the malfunctioning would seem to be caused by some lack in the eye itself. Say, a lack of a rod or a cone. So then it seems like the cause of the malfunctioning is a lack, which seems like the word still holds, because in most cases malfunctions seem to be grounded in lacks, at least in a lot of the physical cases.
Yeah, I see your point. But my issue is consider people which without any external agency, without any external agent, have some kind of malfunction to think about lame. Yeah, you have your leg, but you just were born with some kind of problem in the organs, but still you have all the organs there, which have just a bad relation or not a relation encoded naturally by your substantial form. So there is nothing which is lacking, but there is just a misfunction such that your capabilities of walking or running are stopped. But I see your point, both of you guys. So, yeah.
Father in the back.
Yes. Doc, you're saying that the dysfunction is reducible to the notion of privation. The notion of privation is far more
Absolutely
large, and perhaps dysfunctioning is a privation of order. The notion of order is linked with the relationship between the parts in the whole. And I think the notion of privation of order is a way to reduce the category not the category, the notion of dysfunctioning to the most fundamental notion of privation? What do you think?
I absolutely agree. I just say that both of them are privation, but there's a different way of talking about privation. But I completely agree. Yeah, on your point. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So I think this is a really interesting project. I'm wondering whether you're leaning more into the application of the slot Mereology to Aquinas' thought, or whether you're leaning more into the negative entities question. Because if you're thinking more about negative entities in Aquinas, then I'm wondering what you would do, or I would encourage you to engage with this text from Aquinas' commentary on Metaphysics Gamma, where he reduces, Aristotle's got a ton of different meanings of being, right? And he reduces them to four primary grades of being, where you have substance, accidents, right? And he says both of those have positive being, but substance has it perfectly and accidents have it weakly. And then the third category is things like motio, that have a kind of positive character, but also involve negativity, because motion has to involve a privation. And then the fourth category seems like what you were focusing on, which is negations and privations. But it seems like motiones are going to be resistant to this slot Mereological evaluation. And yet you might think they're plausibly kind of quasi-negative entities.
Right. I didn't see, by the way, the link between slot Mereology and motion, by the way, sorry.
Just that if what you're mainly interested in is application of slot Mereology, then you don't need to worry about this text. If you're mainly interested in negative entities in Aquinas, then it looks like he thinks that there are two things that we say there are such things, right? So we want to say there are negations and privations, but we also want to say there are motions, there are generations and corruptions, and those are things that are, in a very legitimate sense, right? They yes to on sit, but they're not purely positive entities in the world, right? Because, and he thinks the reason they're not purely positive entities in the world is because in their very ratio, they involve one of the fourth grade, namely negations and privations.
Okay, yeah, I see the point.
And so, yeah, so they're not like, when you're counting when you're furnishing the world, right? Those aren't things that you plop in there, right?
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah, okay. No, well, my point was just to enlighten Aquinas on privation due to slot Mereology. But I can really see your point. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, I'm very pleased to welcome our last speaker, Francesco Banfi. He is a third-year DPhil student in medieval philosophy at the University of Oxford, where he is working on a thesis entitled Aquinas on Definition and Essence. His presentation is entitled Aquinas on the Impurity of Essences and the Purity of Forms. Welcome.
Didn't think that. So,
Do you need to...
can I move this one? Sorry.
Is it all right if we...
There are no slides, so. So thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm really grateful to speaking in such a great event. So yeah, my paper is entitled Aquinas on the Impurity of Essences and the Purity of Forms, which is not Aquinas' language. It doesn't speak that way. It's a language mainly drawn from contemporary Aristotelian scholars, by which I mainly mean Oxford people, that in the last 40 years have been like focused on this intense investigation on metaphysics, book Zeta, book 7. Particularly here I'm focusing on the discussion of parts of definitions of sensible material substances in Metaphysics Zeta 10, 11. So these debates revolve around a key issue in Aristotelian metaphysics, what does it mean to be a form, and what does it mean to be the essence of a composite. So I will first present two different interpretative positions on Aristotle's theory definition. The purist position, which is mainly represented by Michael Frede, since his book in the 80s about book Zeta, and the other, the impurist position, that mainly advocated by David Charles today. After this, I will introduce Aquinas' commentary on Metaphysics Zeta 1011, and I will try to show Aquinas' own interpretation and theoretical elaboration, which is very much in continuity with the Ente Essentia. And through this, I aim to clarify his views on the definition of sensible substances and the way in which this view relate to his hylomorphic analysis, hylomorphic conception of substances. And I will compare Aquinas' account with the contemporary positions, trying to see how Aquinas can fit and how can he suggest a solution. So let's start. Aristotle on primary definition. So Aristotle's Metaphysics Zeta 1011 deals mainly with the question of what is primarily definable in a sensible substances. So according to Frede, there are two main questions of these two chapters. First question is what is primarily definable, and the second question is what should we include in the definition of a material substances. So Aristotle, throughout the discussion of Book Zeta, offers a criterion for definability, which we can call predicative simplicity criterion. So the primary object of a definition must not rely on a predicative complex structure of the type of a X set of a Y, because this structure of something said of something else, it's related to the ontological structure of objects depending on other objects. So you can have a primary object, a primary substance, if this object is expressed by a predicative complex definition. So predicative simplicity is related with the question of the ontology of things. So primary objects are the only possessor of primary definitions. So with this criterion, Aristotle rules away accidental compounds, but also sensible compounds of matter and form, since, as he says in Zeta 3, matter in that case form is predicated of matter. So the primary object of definition, it turns out it can be just the form of the thing. That's the starting point. The second question, which is much more debated, having established that the primary object of the definition must be the form, what should we do with sensible definition of material substances? Should we include only the form or also the matter? That's basically the point. So the first account, the purist account. So in Zeta 10, Aristotle discusses whether all parts of a thing must be included in the definition. And he concludes that only formal parts, not material parts, are to be included in the definition. For example, the parts of a circle, its semicircle, are not parts of the definition, whereas the letters of a syllable are parts of the definition, because semicircle are just like material parts of a circle, and letters of a syllable are formal part. So these passages have been used by Frede to answer also to the second question, with the answer basically form again. So the primary object of the definition is a form, and the definition of a sensible substance must include, given this passage of Zeta 10 about syllable and semicircle, must include only the form. So the first position is the pure form account, what I call purism. A sensible substance, this is on the handout, must be defined in terms of its form. The form is intrinsically pure, and this is the hylomorphic ontology implied, namely considered in itself is not related to any matter, even if the form of substances, material substances, exist together with the matter in reality. So Frede has the very super Platonic position. Even the form of a flower is just like, if I consider the form, I don't consider any matter at all related with it. The impurist account, conversely, relies mainly on a passage from Zeta 11, where Aristotle criticizes a philosopher called Socrates the Younger, not the real Socrates, another guy, for comparing the definition of animals to that of a circle, implying that an animal, so a material substance, can be defined without reference to its matter. So Aristotle rejects this analogy and says, emphasizing that matter plays a significant role in the definition of physical objects, contrary to geometrical and mathematical definition. So there is the opposite argument in Z11, and that's exactly what impurists like David Charles stresses a lot, to say that no, actually, the purist view is not the correct one, the impurist view is the correct one. So in the definition, there must be some reference to matter. And Charles has also a strategy to rule out the passage of Zeta10, telling in that passage about syllable and semicircle, Aristotle is talking about a distinction between quantities of matter, like bits of matter of a composite, and these are not included. But and when he talks about formal parts, he's talking about form related to certain material features that are like formally related to the form. So Charles thinks that the primary object of the definition is the form, but this form must be defined in terms of an impure form. And this is where the position of Charles gets, I think, complicated. He implies that underlying this theory of definition, there is an ontology of matter involving forms, or matter that in their essence contains forms. Like the main student of Charles also goes as far, Michael Paramatzis goes as far as to say that actually the form is in itself a composite of matter and form. There are literally like material parts associated to formal parts in the definition, which are not the material parts of the composite, are the material feature of the form defined. Okay, so the two positions have like points or textual points, but I think like kinda have some, both can be seen as problematic. The first of Frege seems excessively Platonic, and this of and the position of Charles, the impurist position, seems to conflate the holomorphic analysis of a substance, because the two ontological roles are not clearly distinguished, I think. So, said that, with this sketch in mind, impurist, purist position, I want to look at Aquinas' interpretation of Zeta 10 and 11. So, there are three fundamental theoretical insights that I put on the end out about the general interpretation of Aquinas. So the first one is the substantial and definitional primacy of the composite over the form. So the first point, the idea is that Aquinas embraces an extremely compatibilist view of the book Zeta with the categories. So in the categories, Aristotle basically says that substances are material physical composites, and composite of matter and form. And Aquinas thinks that Aristotle does not rule out or changes his mind about this. So this is the first point, the substantial primacy of the composite. And this is associated to the definitional primacy of the composite. So the primary object of definition for Aquinas is the composite of matter and form. There is no problem of matter-form predication, because he has a very original interpretation of the chapter 3 of book Zeta, whereas he thinks that the matter that Aristotle is speaking there is prime matter. So it's not really a subject of predication, like because like it's only potentially a subject, given like the pure potentiality of prime matter. So matter for predication is not really a problem for composite substances, and the primary object is the composite substances, and this does not compromise the predicative simplicity of the essential predication of a composite substance. In an essential predication such as man is an animal, there is no addition of two different natures for Aquinas. The unity of substantial form and prime matter guarantees the unity of the composite, and it follows that it guarantees the predicative simplicity that expressed by the predication, by the definition. So, first point, the composite is primary substance and a primary object of definition. Second point, Aquinas the distinction between form of the part and form of the whole. And this is like what I really want to focus. In Zeta 10, Aquinas present a first position concerning the definition of sensible substance, and he names Averroes, who taught that the whole essence of a man is to be defined through his form, namely, in the case of man, his soul. And Aquinas criticizes this position of Averroes, which is really similar to the Frege one. So basically, Averroes thinks the definition of a composite, let's take human being, is just his soul, his form, namely his soul. So there is no distinction between essence and form. But Aquinas then goes to present a second position, which he embraces, which is the one of Avicenna. According to the second interpretation, the distinction between essence and form is not only conceptual, as in the case of Averroes, but the two really play two different ontological and explanatory roles in the compound. Form and essence differs from a substantial form, has a whole difference from a part. The essence of a species is a composite of matter and form, and this is the true opinion, he thinks, of Aristotle, that wants to maintain that sensible matter is part of the species. See, so he also formulates an argument for the fact that essences are in matter through by way of definition. If definition of substances must contain matter in order to be properly distinguished from mathematical definition, and at the same time, if real definition must express the very same parts of the essence, it follows that matter must be present in the essence and definition of a composite. So, and the third theoretical insight is the distinction between individual and common matter. Now, I don't have time to stress it, but it's very important because obviously the matter present in the definition is not just individual matter, but it's common matter. So the matter that is part of the species, the matter that is, let's say, like the common formal characteristics of the species. So flesh and bones in the case of human beings, like that type of flesh and bones that are associated with the form are part of the essence. And this also is very important because allows to Aquinas to do a very, very similar move with of the one that Charles made with respect to the passages in which Aristotle says there is no matter in the definition, because he says this is an individual matter, whereas common matter is present. How much time do I have, Steve? 7 minutes. Okay, Grace. So Aquinas' illomorphic the result is this twofold illomorphic composition. The first level is substantial form plus prime matter, and the result is the actual substance of man. The second level is the level of the essence, substantial form plus common matter, and this is the essence of the species. And these two, I want to describe these two levels because I want to say that these two things are distinct in the sense that they really play two different explanatory roles. Like the first, the substantial form, actualize matter, bring it to the substantial reality and actuality, whereas the form, which is a composite of common matter and form, is responsible for putting a certain substance under a determinate species. So there are two different roles, explanatory roles of this these two level of illomorphic composition. Given this, the originality of Aquinas' position, because this is probably, I didn't stress this, but it's fundamental that Aquinas has this distinction between form and essence, whereas in the contemporary debate, there is no distinction between form and essence. So said that, I want to try to put very briefly Aquinas' position to fit Aquinas' position in the contemporary debate. So is he a purist? Is he an impurist? I think that Aquinas is definitely an impurist about essences. So essences must be in matter, and the kind of matter that is associated with in the essence is the common matter. And I think he has basically two reasons to be an impurist about essence. So I individuated fundamentally two arguments against the Averroistic, or we can say also against the Frede account. The first objection, I call it on the handout the extrinsic matter objection. So if the essence of the sensible substances were only be the form, that would mean, both for Aristotle and Frede, that the matter associated with the form in the compound, so let's say flesh and bones, would be kind of irrelevant. If the essence is just spelled out by the form, I could maintain the human soul and put like a different type of body, like a cat body, and you still, according to his theory of definition and essence, you will still have a human being. There is a way to answer these objections that I think is shared somehow both by Frede, explicitly by Frede, but I think also by Averroes, which is, of course, in the definition there is just the form, but to use Frede's language, this form hypothetically necessitates some type of matter that must be there. But to this answer, I think that Aquinas has another objection, which is the unity objection. So if we say that the definition and the essence contain just matter, but this matter somehow necessitates something that is like the necessary matter, then you would have a secondary type of definition, not the definition that spells out the essence, but a secondary type of definition in which you have to include this necessitated matter, but that would mean that it's still only secondary because the essence is just the form. So if it's a secondary type of definition, there is a kind of accidental unity. There is not a real substantial unity. And of course, one can just reject the idea that there is a necessary matter implied by the form, but at that point, the two objections constitute a dilemma because you expose yourself to the first objection. So Aquinas has good reasons to be an impurist. I want to conclude with the most, let's say, it's still work in progress in a sense, but the idea is that Aquinas is an impurist about essences, but is a qualified purist about forms. How much time do I have? Sorry? 3 minutes, okay. I use the language of qualified purism because I want to say that for Aquinas, the form, being only a part of the composite essence, cannot be properly defined as if it had a proper essence, because it's not, again, it's not properly a real, a complete substance. So in virtue of his incompleteness, we can say fundamentally these two things. First, in the definition of a form, there must be some reference to matter. For example, the definition of human soul must make reference to an organic body. So from this point of view, it would look like that Aquinas is an impurist also about forms. But the second point, that contrary to Charles, this kind of definition is not a primary definition, it's a secondary definition. And the main character of the secondary definition, the definition secundum quid, the definition by addition, for Aquinas is the fact that the essence spelled out must make reference to something external to the essence. That's typical in the case of accidents. So I define an accident, but I must make reference to something external to the accident. And this is also the case of sensible forms, I think. So it's differently from Charles, the essence of the form does not contain matter. The essence of the form, what it is of the form, is pure. But there is an essential relation with matter, given the fact that matter and form are part of the composite essence. So there is an interdependence, as Charles sees, but Aquinas rejects this idea that forms are somehow intrinsically material. And so in this way, he sort of like escapes from the risk of an ontological collapse between the analysis of matter and form. And secondly, this is my last point, I think this might seem like a very subtle and not super interesting distinction, but I think it plays a fundamental role. I don't have time to spell out here all the thing, but if you look at text 6, Aquinas fundamentally connects he's discussing whether matter and form, whether the human soul is a composite of matter and form. And this is the most similar position with respect to the impurist position, we could say. And he clearly connects a purist claim, which is the form in itself does not contain matter, with a priority claim. So the form does not contain matter in virtue of its priority over prime matter. Form is essentially act, it gives actual being to prime matter, and prime matter is purely potential. Giving the priority of actuality over potentiality and the fact that the two are like the opposites, the idea is that form cannot contain matter in virtue of its being act with respect to a potency. And this is, of course, totally different from Charles' account of the priority of form over matter. And I have a quote here, which I don't think is a chance, that Charles speaks about forms, impure forms, in terms of essentially material capacities or structures. He has a very sophisticated account of priority of form over matter, but of course not an account in which form as a priority in Aquinas sense, a priority in being, a very strong priority in being, because of course he does not have a notion of prime matter. Charles' terminology would be, of course, really problematic for Aquinas, because it seems to conflate at the end accidental form and substantial form, given that there is no priority in being of form with respect to matter. So to conclude, I think Aquinas' account as a much more balanced at the end vision of the problem of the definition of substances and the hylomorphic analysis is certainly makes his own interpretation of Aristotle's text, which is obviously not always super faithful to the Aristotle text, but I also think that mainly almost all contemporary Aristotelian scholars have to somehow force the text of Aristotle in order to arrive to an interpretation. So I think that Aquinas can still be an interesting proponent of what's going on in that chapters.
Thank you, that was very interesting. So I want to just ask a clarificatory question first, and then maybe a follow-up. So when you say Aquinas on the qualified pure form, that's the form of the part.
Yep.
And would you say that it's fair to say that his views about the form of the part are a lot like Averroes or Euclid's view about the form of the whole or the essence? So
Sorry, can you repeat? I'm not sure I got.
Yeah, I was just saying a kind of analogy between what he wants to say about the form of the part and what Freda wanted to say
About the form of the whole. Yes, yes.
Because, you might try to raise this extrinsic matter objection to Aquinas, and he'll say the kind of thing Freda would say, no, there's an essential connection, but this form of the part somehow. But then I wondered, is there going to be a version of the unity objection that could be raised
Against Aquinas.
against Aquinas?
Well, here's something that I maybe didn't specify well. When I show these two levels of philomorphic composition, of course, in the first level, we are talking about two distinguished principles. In the second level, we are talking about a qualified way to talk about the essence of a thing as a composite of matter and form. I don't think it's a composite of prime matter and form. So there is no there is a unified object there. And the matter, in my interpretation, I don't have time to spell it out in this paper, but in my interpretation, the matter is fundamentally three-dimensional matter, as like Viola Klima is kind of shown in a paper about the entered essentia. And it's three-dimensional matter, which is matter already formalized, actualized by the form, and the form is like the responsible all the other levels of perfection. So I would say something like flesh and bones plus form, which is flesh and bone taken as three-dimensional, quadri-dimensional object, plus form, which is like signifies all the other perfections of the essence, is a way to spell out the essence in terms of composition. But I think it's important for Aquinas to spell out still in terms of composition the essence, given taking for granted this unity, because then you would be exposed to like how to think about matter in the essence and the kind of objections that I showed.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. I think it might be worth highlighting that. I mean, it seems like because he does it at the level of form and the part, he's got these resources that aren't available to the other.
I think that's my take, yeah. Of course, like in Zeta 17, basically Aristotle says form is essence, so it's not easy, like from an interpretative point of view, for contemporary scholars to imagine something like Aquinas. Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe a suggestion that in part follows up on that is it might actually help make your point even clearer under section 3 on page 1 to reformulate those equations that you've got using the form of the whole, form of the part, language, and then to add a third equation, which is the form of the whole plus individual matter equals actual substance made.
Right.
Because then you've got like all of the distinctions that you've made are there clearly in play, and you see what's relevantly different in each case.
Yeah, I see that. Yes. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks so much for the paper. It's very interesting. So I wanted to ask about whether besides Charles and Freda, there's a kind of silent majority of Aristotle scholars that are really agreeing with Aquinas. So for sure, they're not using this language of form of the part, form of the whole.
Okay.
But it seems like a lot of people would want to say, look, what Aristotle really cares about is definition of substances, and for material substances, it has to include matter in the definition.
Yeah.
But they're not willing to go all the way to an impure form
view
of Charles. And so are these people all sort of tacitly agreeing with Aquinas, or do you think there's still some important differences?
I think there are differences. So I think the category is sometimes it has been called the soft purist. So are not like hard purist like Frede. Of course, like it was cool to do the hard purist thing here in the paper to do but I didn't consider the soft purism thing, which is kind of similar in a sense to Aquinas one. So basically people like Mary-Louise Gill and Michael Lu, which was in this university, I believe, they had an account for which there is something more similar to the idea that yes, like it has to be defined in terms of form, so it's just a definition of form, but then you have a kind of secondary definition, physical definition, that is somehow includes matter, position like that, or a difference like in Lu there is almost a difference between form and essence, and the essence is somehow material. But I don't think there is this sharp distinction with these two, because they are like related to the clear affirmation of Aristotle in Zeta 17. I think that form is essence at the end. That's what they cannot like overcome, I think.
A question of my own. I'm mainly here to learn. The question is, I just assigned my students a text of the Summa, question 29, about persons. And in that text, Aquinas is talking about nature in the context also of essence. And I'm just wondering where nature might fit into this.
So by nature, I think like we can agree that essence and nature pretty much like overcome in this regard. So the essence is the principle that makes something under a determinate species. So it's like the word nature and essence somehow like overcome. So when I'm speaking about the nature of man, I'm referring to like that kind of thing that has flesh and bones plus a substantial form of that kind of type. So yeah.
More or less synonymous.
Yeah, I would say synonymous almost. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you very much.